Happy Easter to you all. We have two readings before us this morning, one from Acts and one from John. You may like to go and look them up and read them at your leisure, Acts 10 and John 20. You can find out what they are online by looking up Easter 2022. The second one is very much more about experience, and so those of us who have that learning style, we learn by doing, might find it easy to relate to the second reading than the first. Those of us who learn by thinking about things might relate more closely to the first. John is the fourth of the Gospels, one of the last books in the Greek scriptures to be written. And we have two accounts that don't quite fit together. My wife Liz works at the World Land Trust, and one of their patrons is fairly well known and apparently always used to wear a blue shirt to enable continuity. You know, those of you who've been in visual broadcasting will know, no doubt, that it's all very well to wear identifiable clothes, but you have to make sure that you're wearing the same thing if the thing is supposed to be happening on the same day. So David Attenborough apparently just had a blue shirt. I don't know whether you want to go back to his earlier broadcast when he was sitting amongst the gorillas to check that out, but apparently that's the story. Note to self. We've got two paragraphs. The first talks about Mary going to the tomb and going to tell the disciples, and then John and Peter running to the tomb. And then there's a bit of a sort of for those of you that remember televisions when we used to actually have to tune them in, it sort of goes a bit crazed, and then we turn the dial, and we find ourselves back in the same spot, but it hasn't quite sort of fitted together quite right, and we find Mary standing outside the tomb. So it's for you to decide whether that's editor or redactor, as we call them when they're dealing with the Bible, an editor error, or whether time has passed, who knows. But we have two stories. We have chaps and women. And I would say that probably means that we don't need to worry too much about gender in relation to faith. We might have different approaches to the story. One of the things that struck me about the first paragraph is that the two men, Peter and John, run to the tomb, and there's nothing there apart from the linen. I don't know whether you're interested in watching those sort of thrillers on the television, those sort of psychological thrillers. Again, referring back to my wife Liz, she does like watching them, especially ones where there's lots of shrieking and violence and whatnot, and she disappears under the duvet from time to time. That's not really my bag. But she usually tells me about sort of 5 minutes in that she's worked it all out, which is extremely clever. But there's usually evidence. And here these people have gone just like the what they call the pathologists who decide to take on the role of the police, and they go off to some deserted warehouse without telling anybody that they are there. So we have John and Peter gone off to this graveyard. I was going to say dead of night, but first thing in the morning or whenever it is they go. And it's all a bit sort of suspect. And there's no evidence except for these bits of cloth. How do we relate to or respond to that? It's possibly a bit like visiting an old church like Thorrington when there's nobody in it, and you try the door and it does open, and you put your nose round the door and you look in, and there's nothing very much there except that there is everything there. It's quite an odd thought, isn't it? They were expecting something, but they found something else. They were challenged, and it made them think. It's interesting also that these are disciples, but we are told they return home. Verse 10, then the disciples returned to their homes. You would think that it would say something like, and then in disbelief, these sort of punters just went home. But they are called disciples. They didn't see anything. They go home. We are told, however, that they see and believe, but they return home. That's about looking, thinking, it seems to me, being a bit cerebral about it, thinking and working out what does all this presence, absence mean to us. And then the second paragraph, I haven't told this story here before, so I've got at least another year for you all to forget before I tell it here again. But when I was sort of student age, I remember watching a very beautiful young woman performing. Now, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a character called Carmen who did what I would call rap. I suppose we might call it hip-hop or something else even today. But he used to sort of sing poetry. And over a sort of a very drum-heavy backing musical track, which occasionally sort of brought trumpets in and from time to time, to raise the spirits and synthesizers and the like. But he did this sort of narrative of this story. And this woman mimed in traditional sort of, I don't know my drama very well, I'm afraid, but she mimed it dressed in a sort of a black and white stripy top and with a whitened face and black leggings and some sort of stage trainery boot kind of footwear stuff. And I remember being in, this was up in North Wales, one of their sort of civic theatres, darkness all around with a spotlight on her. And I can still feel the goose pimples coming up when we got to this line. So she was miming with this very powerful soundtrack going on in the background. Mary stands weeping outside looking into the tomb. We're with her looking at our past, our hurt and our failings, at the empty church. She sees two angels. She has a chat with them. Then she sees somebody she doesn't recognise, interestingly. And then we have this name. And if you can imagine this stage, light, a sort of a clown figure dressed, miming, looking down, crouched up, all despairing, broken and hurting, tearful. Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Then Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and looked. And it's just such a powerful image that God calls us by name. For those of you who are more interested in here than here, God calls us by name. And that image is extraordinary. We've got a very wiry, wire-haired pointer dog. And even in the midst of his most bonkers, sort of funny half hours, when we call his name out, he will turn and look at us. And he's got that gun dog look that he does actually hold us in his eye. And that is turning your face. That is God turning God's face on us. It's not a disturbing holding of gaze, but it's a gaze that I understand. And I'm sure this isn't the case here, but teachers are having to teach children when they arrive at preschool and nursery and in their reception classes at school, early years. They are actually having to teach children how to make eye contact and follow with their eyes, because sadly, so few parents have experience of parenting or friends who are doing parenting that they share and learn and understand that it's actually doesn't develop relationships if we put a baby with a bottle in its mouth on a sofa with a flat screen in front of it. They don't understand eye contact, looking, face, turning to where the sound comes from, and it has to be taught. Whereas breastfeeding, it's just innate. It happens, and that's just so extraordinary. And that is what we've got here. We've got that parental relationship that we might have lost, that we might be longing for. And if it's not us, the people out there need to hear and know that God isn't irrelevant, that God is speaking their name. And all they have to do is turn from looking at death. And we know all too well with climate breakdown, plastic pollution, biodiversity loss, and Ukraine, Yemen, anywhere else we choose to look, even in our own bodies, there is death and pain. And we can focus on that. And whilst we need to empathise, whilst we need to stand alongside, arguably, and not send people to Rwanda, we also need to recognise that there is this loving God who calls us by name, and that we can speak truth and hope and love and relationship. Arguably, that love should counter that hate. And we are people, Easter people, of love, joy and hope. And just briefly turning to our first reading in Acts, there is a line there in verse 39, we are witnesses. You may think, well, look at him standing up there in his posh bit of cut-out curtain that's turned into some sort of poncho. It's all very well for him, with all that experience and training to pontificate. But I would suggest you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for something about what I'm talking about going on in your lives, in your minds. You may believe in the church building and would say that you have no faith, but there are plenty of other libraries or National Trust properties that you can give your time and attention to. It doesn't have to be this building. And I'm not saying you have to explain or understand that. You might be a head person or a heart person. But we all have our stories. We've all come through good times and bad times. Sometimes good times send us away from faith. Sometimes bad times, good times turn us towards faith. We all have our stories, and nobody can take that away from us. And we might have thought about it. We might just feel it. We might not write it down. But may God give us the grace to talk to people about it, just as Luke, who wrote Acts, wrote it down and talked to people about it. That people may hear, and if they hear, they may believe. They might decide to come and see. And hopefully that'll turn their lives round and give them hope, enable them to have eye contact with God and to understand a little bit more about who they are and how the world works, at least from a faith perspective. Amen.